And hello, I hope everybody's having a great evening or whenever you're watching this, if you're watching this after the fact. My name's John Harry. I'm with the Milwaukee County Historical Society and the Pabst Mansion. Tonight, we are doing a joint presentation with MCHS and the Pabst Mansion. We have a fantastic program coming up that I'm sure you're all just waiting for on the edge of your seats, which we can't wait to have with, which is Captain Pabst Beyond the Brewhouse with John Eastberg, who is waiting in the wings right now. Before we get to John, and to let everybody kind of settle in, if you need to grab a beverage, it was National Beer Day yesterday. Of course, it's Milwaukee, so every day can be that if that's something that you want to have. But I'll just give you some announcements of what's going on with both organizations. So to start with, the Pabst Mansion is actually reopening on Saturday. So if you want to go, there's time ticketing. There's a family, like kid friendly tour on Saturday morning as well. Otherwise, self-guided tours are available right now. And you can find all the info on that at pabstmansion.com. And I cut out for a second there, so I'll just say that again. So that's all available at pabstmansion.com. And then the Milwaukee County Historical Society, our exhibit right now is where the waters, Milwaukee, where the waters meet. So it's all about water in Wisconsin. This is actually our last exhibit-related program for the run of this part of the exhibit with John Eastberg tonight and Captain Pabst is. But the exhibit is up through the end of April. So if you haven't seen the exhibit yet about water in Milwaukee, make sure that you come down to the Historical Society and see that. We also, if you haven't seen it yet, or heard it yet, rather, we have a podcast about the influenza pandemic of 1918, what's commonly referred to as the Spanish flu. And you can find that at milwaukeehistory.net as well, or listen wherever podcasts are, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we have a beer that is still on tap. I checked in yesterday with the folks at Indeed Brewing Company. It's themed off of our water exhibit. So Indeed Brewing Company has a brewery and tap room down in Walker's Point on South 2nd Street, and it is a Irish foreign extra stout, and that is still on tap right now down there, and $1 from each purchase from that goes to the Milwaukee County Historical Society as well. And I have talked very much, and I don't need to talk much more. So we'll do a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions for John, just pop them in the comments, and I'll be sifting through those, and we'll be asking questions of John at the end. But tonight's main attraction is Beyond the Brewhouse, Captain Frederick Pabst. John, will have a great time, and we'll see you at the end.
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate it. And greetings, everyone. It's great to be with you tonight. And I'm so happy that we can kind of celebrate National Beer Day and what would have been Captain Pabst's 185th birthday, which would have been March 28th. But I'm just going to jump in to our presentation tonight. And I thought I would begin kind of towards the end of his life, when he had built his home on Grand Avenue, the Pabst Mansion. And this is his study. And one of the things that I've really started appreciating about this room and the particular work of art that we're going to look at for a moment is that Captain Pabst was constantly drawing himself back to where he was born and where he was raised. And that was in Nicholas Reut's small hamlet south of Leipzig, so in what we would consider Eastern Germany today. But over the mantelpiece, and we'll zoom in here, was a painting entitled Plowing in Saxony by Richard Lorenz. And Richard Lorenz, as it turns out, was born very close to where Captain Pabst grew up. And he had emigrated to America from Saxony in 1886 and went on to be a great artist in Milwaukee and has a national reputation today. But this particular painting would have recalled Captain Pabst's days as a young boy, very rural. I always say it's that part of Germany is as flat as central Illinois. And so for people like myself that always kind of think everything has to look Bavarian and Alpine, this part of Germany is not that. It's very flat. And this is where Captain Pabst had his start. and he spent his early childhood there. And in 1848, like millions of other people around the world and around Europe, decided to kind of sell their goods and move to America. And this is exactly what his parents, Gottlieb and Frederica, did. And they traveled north to Hamburg and boarded a vessel and came to America. In the fall of 1848, they arrived in Milwaukee. And I won't say that they were less than impressed, but it was a town of 20,000, which would have seemed large to them. But that wasn't necessarily, I guess, the opportunity that they were looking for. So they went down to Chicago. And unfortunately, the following year, his mother, Frederica, had passed away in the cholera epidemic that took place later that year. And so Gottlieb and his little boy, Frederick, were waiting tables at the Mansion House Hotel in downtown Chicago. And Frederick did that for a couple of years, and then he discovered that he really was drawn to river and lake commerce, and at the age of 14 becomes a cabin boy. And this was kind of he loved this part of his life, and he even said in his latter years that if he could do anything and choose an occupation to do if he had to start all over again, it would have been seafaring. So this was who he was. And I think that he kept the title of Captain Pabst the rest of his life. It says a lot. So this photograph was taken about the time that he would have been around 19. And we're so fortunate that he was well photographed almost through his entire life. And what I've always particularly enjoyed about this photograph is that it is a young man who is clearly displaying the early signs of his wealth that he has attained. So he has his gold watch chain, his gold ring on his finger, and his stud on his shirt. And so Frederick Pabst is already looking to make his mark on the world. By the time he's in his early 20s, he is the captain of the Comet, which was, you wouldn't necessarily think about looking at this photograph, a brand new pristine vessel by the Goodrich Line, built in 1857. But this was his favorite vessel that he sailed aboard, and he was captain. And his route was along the western edge of Illinois, northern Illinois, and up through Wisconsin. And so in those early days, you would actually kind of follow the captain of the vessel that you wanted to travel with. And you can see the route that he did between Milwaukee, Port Washington, Sheboygan, Manitowoc, and Two Rivers. And one of those families that liked traveling with him was Philip Best and his eldest daughter, Maria. So here I'd like to introduce you to Philip Best in the upper left-hand corner, his wife, Maria, which gets a little confusing, and then his eldest daughter, Maria, and then Frederick Pabst. And so it was the Bests that traveled aboard this vessel. And of course, it was the Best family that had started a small brewing company in Milwaukee in 1844 with Philip's father, Jacob Sr., and his three other brothers, Jacob Jr., Charles, and Lorenz. And by the time that they would have met Captain Pabst, Philip would have consolidated the Best Brewing Company under his own or his sole ownership. So he was very much in charge. And so Frederick and Maria courted, and 2 years later in 1862, they were married in this cottage that was located right kind of at the center of the brewing company. If you're familiar with the Pabst complex today, it's where the Frederick Lofts are at this moment. So Frederick remained as a captain for about a year and a half after they were married. I think he had probably wanted to keep his sailing career, but it was for a storm that took place in December of 1863 that changed his career, and he, I think, decided to stay on land on a semi-permanent basis. So the voyage of the Seabird, which was an even newer vessel and is looking brighter in this particular photograph, the Seabird had been built in 1859, so it was a 4-year-old vessel, and they were traveling in December south from Sheboygan, having clear sailing, and then a winter storm kind of descended on the vessel, and it took 12 hours to go from Sheboygan down to Whitefish Bay, and it was just impossible to get to the harbor at Milwaukee. And so he decided to beach the vessel, which actually saved the crew and the passengers, and indeed the vessel ultimately. But that's what decided that he would leave his nautical career. And so he joined his father-in-law in the brewing business, and Frederick Pabst had no knowledge of the brewing industry, so he really had to learn it from inside the barrel out, as they used to say in the 19th century. And so for the consideration of $21,000, which would have been obviously a tremendous amount of money at that time, Philip Best sold a half interest in the Best brewing company at that time. And so Frederick Pabst got underway, and eventually the other half of the brewing company is sold to Emil Shandine, who would have been Philip Best's other son-in-law, who married Lizette Best Shandine. And so that kind of sets up the dynamic. And so it would have been Captain Pabst and Emil Shandine that would have been in charge of the leadership of the Best Brewing Company. And this was kind of perfect timing, I suppose, for any American industry. If you had good luck and were able to get things underway. There were so many changes that were going on as far as technology and transportation, and just kind of everything was changing in the 1870s and 1880s, and they were perfectly poised to take advantage of this. And I think the one thing that Frederick Pabst brought to this organization was, because of his experience in shipping, that he really understood the moving of materials from different parts of the country to another. So as the company started shipping to further and further away from the brewing company, he really understood that. And a New York brewer said at the time, I really like this quote, Frederick Pabst, he has one of the greatest minds in organizing and systemizing details so as to secure the best results in economy of time and labor, and of thus increasing profits. His plans for his deep mine seas to the very end are uniformly successful. So with that in mind, the brewing company, when he started, was producing about 3,000 barrels of beer a year. And from that point, by 1873, so a little less than a decade in, they were producing 100,000 barrels and were then among the largest of the brewers in America at that time, which is remarkable. One of the other things that, when people look at the brewing industry and why Milwaukee was so successful, and, was it the water, was it the access to grain that was being grown in our hinterland? But a lot of historians have really theorized that it was our cold climates and the producing of inexpensive ice that really, in those days before mechanical refrigeration, really gave Milwaukee the edge. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix. So the cottage that Frederick and Maria Pabst were married in was eventually lifted up, wheeled away several blocks, and then on that site, so we're back on that same location at between 8th and 9th and Chestnut, or now Juno. Henry Koch, who was the architect of City Hall eventually, was the architect of this Italianate home that the Pabst built in 1875. It was within that home that they raised their 5 children. And here we have, from left to right, Frederick, Emma, Gustav, Marie, and Elizabeth. They actually had 10 children, and these were the 5 that survived to adulthood. She had 2 children that unfortunately died young at the beginning of their marriage, and then between 1865 and 1872, they had these 5 children, and then unfortunately there were 3 later children that did not survive as well. And this photograph would have been taken around 1874, 1875, and this is the only photograph we have of all 5 Pabst children together. So in those early years, the employment roles of the company were extremely small, which always surprises me, because when the Wisconsin State Census was taken, they would take numbers of how many employees that there were at the brewing company, and it was actually a really small number. And I'm thinking by the 1870s, there were probably between 20, 30, maybe 35 employees of the brewing company, but a lot of them were family members as well. And in this photograph, I'm zooming in on the lower right-hand corner of this photo. We have the future president of the brewing company, Gustav Pabst, near the horses' heads, and then Emil Shandine is holding onto the wagon, and with Captain Pabst in the wagon, and then Maria Best Pabst and her sister Lizette are standing just next to the buggy. So again, this is a very homespun part. This is probably one of the old malt house at the brewing company in those early days. But things grew exceedingly fast. The company did very well, were recognized early on for the superior product that they were producing. They received an award at the Centennial Exhibition in 1876 in Philadelphia. They also won, as you can see, the gold medal at Paris Exhibition in 1878. And as you can also see from this letterhead, they also started having branch offices throughout the Midwest. And Pabst and Schlitz and Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis were considered the Western shipping brewers, and then you had a contingent of the Eastern brewers in New York, primarily, that dominated that market. And we'll see how Captain Pabst tried wedging into that market a little later. So the Philip Best Brewing Company throughout the 1880s is growing up to 700,000 barrels per year. They're starting to do national advertising campaigns. And this is a leaflet that was produced in the mid 1880s. And what could have shaken the company a little bit in the late 1880s was the death of his brother-in-law and the vice president of the Philip Best Brewing Company, Emil Shandine, died unexpectedly in the summer of 1888. But at that point, his wife, who was Philip Best's middle daughter, or younger daughter, I should say, Lizette, took over the role of vice president of the company. But Captain Pabst really took the opportunity to push his name forward. And 8 months after Emil Shandine had passed away, the name was formally changed to the Pabst Brewing Company on March 12th, 1889. And the Pabst emblem with the red circle, which they used all the way up to the beginning of Prohibition, was actually from 1886, first being used by the Philip Best Brewing Company. And to recognize those earlier roots, the B on the hop leaf was retained, and then in the red circle, Pabst Milwaukee was added. And so beginning right away in 1889, Captain Pabst really wants to get the Pabst name out there. And you can imagine that changing a corporate name kind of drastically like this uh, would be kind of tough in the 19th century before social media could push it out and that sort of thing. But they really got the Pabst name out. He had been well associated with the brewing company for essentially a quarter century at that time. And so the Pabst name took very quickly on that. And there were a number of things that he did to kind of get the name out right away. And one of those events was the arrival of the Grand Army of the Republic encampment in Milwaukee in the summer of 1889. So just a few months after the name change had taken place. And so Captain Pabst, when he had heard there was a mock naval battle in Milwaukee Harbor planned for the event. And I'm always hoping that historic photographs are going to turn up of this mock naval battle and what that would have looked like. But to raise money for this whole encampment, they were going to charge $1 per chair for these 15,000 soldiers that were going to be viewing this battle. And so when Captain Pabst heard that, he said that he would pick up the tab. So $15,000 gift was given, and he had written that he felt that the soldiers should enjoy the hospitalities our city can offer and let it be without money or without price. They have well earned the consideration, and we owe it to ourselves that our guests do not go away and say that any part of Milwaukee's hospitality had to be bought or paid for. And so everybody was very moved that Captain Pabst had done this. And so a parade of 20,000 Civil War veterans changed their route so they could go up Chestnut Street, or I was saying the Juno, and this is the view looking west, very familiar view to all of us in Milwaukee. And so Captain Pabst and Mrs. Pabst and their daughter Emma were stationed in one of the office windows at the Pabst Brewing Company, and very, very gratefully accepted the cheers of all the soldiers that passed by their window. So these factory scenes are always kind of overblown. The Pabst one's actually relatively accurate. The building in the lower right-hand corner was never built, and some of the buildings over to the right sides I don't think were built. But by and large, this is what the Pabst Brewing Company looked like, the largest producer of lager beer through the 1890s. Their capacity was right around 1 million barrels of beer a year. And it was a very remarkable growth when you think of just a few minutes ago, we were at a handful of buildings, and here, a quarter century later, this enormous factory. Captain Pabst obviously was very proud of the factory itself and encouraged people to come and take tours. This was a pass that was handed out so people could redeem it at the brewing company. And, group tours, that's what's the name of the game then as it is today. And here we can see a group of people visiting the Pabst Brewing Company. They've all received their silk blue ribbon, and they're wearing it on their jackets. Some of them have a free sample of beer, except for the gentleman on the far right, who I've always thought was a very somber gentleman on this brewery tour. But again, they were going through all parts of the brewing company. The Brewhouse was kind of the main event, so people could actually see the brewing process. This is an early photograph that actually one of these visitors would have taken while they were there. And, this gleaming copper kettles with the skylights above, and really just bathing that entire space in this amazing light. And in 1892, Captain Pabst commissioned the Baumbach Glass Company here in Milwaukee to produce this amazing stained glass window of King Gambrinus, the patron of brewing, sitting upon his throne with his glass of beer. And so again, it was just like this magnificent aesthetic beauty as well of the brewing company. It wasn't just about churning out as much beer as they possibly could. There really was this thought of people seeing this, number one, but also just the beauty of the place. So let's pop into a couple of other little departments in the brewing company. The fire department, I've always thought was kind of a great photograph, especially with the Pabst name and hop leaf logo emblazoned on all the fire equipment. This was a very real concern at brewing companies in the 1890s and into the 20th century. Fire was a real concern. There had been a couple of major fires at Best Brewing Company in 1879, and then one at Pabst in 1891. The malting process tended to have issues with small fires starting, so you wanted to keep them small before they grew into something else. So the fire department was a necessity to have them right there. Also, like the office of Joseph Catherines, who's the advertising manager of Pabst during the late 1890s and just into the 20th century. All of these different pieces of advertising. This is just a fraction of all the ephemera that Pabst Brewing Company was putting out in the 1890s that would go into their tied houses or their saloons, that would be sent to patrons that were selling their products. Like the malt extract was a very popular product, a kind of a malt preparation in a bottle that did have alcoholic content, but was more of a tonic than like a consumable beer. Captain Pabst also appreciated the importance of national ad campaigns, and he was one of the first ones to sign on to a 3-year staggered advertising campaign. And the first year, it was essentially the history of brewing through the 3 years, and there's some pretty outstanding pieces of advertising that came out of this. So, of course, the history of brewing begins with Egypt. So the entire year of 1895, you have all of these Egyptian motifs and pyramids with the Pabst logo on it and the like. The following year, in 1896, the art of brewing was developed by the Germans. And so you have cathedrals with stained glass windows that have the Pabst emblem. And of course, you have this knight with the Pabst emblem on his shield. And I mean, to me, these are a lot of fun. And then the last year, 1897, was perfection in brewing is reached in America. And of course, you're to take the hint that it's perfected by Pabst in America. So here we have the inauguration of George Washington. Another one is the Old North Church with the Pabst logo actually into the church. So it was great stuff. So with all this advertising, it actually generated a lot of beer sales. And this is the morning delivery that would have left to take Pabst beer to all the different parts of the city, to all the different tied houses. And it's a great photograph. The Empire Brewery, as this was known even back in the earlier days of the Best Brewing Company era, everything was up on that hill. For a while they maintained the former Melms Brewing Company on the south side, which was known as the South Side Brewery, but eventually that was phased out in 1886. That one actually made more sense because it had access to rail yards, it had access to the river, and up on that hill at 9th and Chestnut, or 9th and Juneau, everything had to be taken up that were raw materials, and everything had to come down that hill to go to the shipping depot, which was on 3rd and Highland. So you think of just all the horsepower that was needed, and Captain Pabst loved his horses. These were Percheron horses, which he especially imported from France and bred at his farm. And here we are at the farm. So located in Wauwatosa, almost a straight shot out from the brewing company, was the stock farm, which the Philip S. Brewing Company had acquired in 1871, about 217 acres. And by 1885, Captain Pabst had purchased it from the brewing company for his own personal use for breeding his horses. There was actually a small racetrack that was there. And on top of that, they had what they used as their summer home or their summer villa, which I've always thought was funny that their summer home was only about 4 or 5 miles away from their regular residence. But this was a beautiful spot up on that hill. And apparently, in those early days before the trees and the buildings had been built, you actually had a view of Lake Michigan from that hill. This is a broadside advertising Captain Pabst's stud services for his Percheron stallions that he had out at the farm. He actually had a painting commemorate one of his favorite Percheron horses, Berg, which is the center horse, the Doppel gray horse that's being led out. And of course, you can see Captain Pabst, and then with his 2 sons, Fred with the filly, and then the farm manager, and then Gustav, who's standing closest to Captain Pabst. And the Pabst summer home is in the background, but this is a great painting that was done in 1887 and hung in his offices at the brewing company. Of course, because of Pabst and the humane treatment of animals, he was a founding member of the Wisconsin Humane Society, which was founded in 1879, and had sponsored a horse ambulance for Wisconsin Humane Society. So horses that needed attention could be safely taken off the street and then hopefully recover at a different place. Towards the end of the horse era of the Pabst Brewing Company, or for all the brewing companies, by 1903, 1904, trucks were starting to come into use, but kind of the best Percheron horses were gathered together for a 6-horse hitch, and it was entered into the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, and they won the international prize for a 6-horse hitch. And they eventually went on a trip touring state fairs around the country, and they actually had their own private rail car, which we can see here, which for 2 years, these horses toured throughout the country. So by 1890s, the brewing company was so large and so busy that the Pabst decided to move out onto Grand Avenue, or now West Wisconsin Avenue, into kind of this bucolic residential neighborhood. Emil Shandine, right before his death, had begun the construction of their mansion at 24th and Grand, and Lizette, his widow, completed the house. It was the largest home ever built in Milwaukee. It's just around 40,000 square feet and costing just over $300,000. The Pabst began construction of their home a year later in 1890, designed by Farring Kloss, with a more modest 20,000 square feet and for $254,000, all in, including furniture and artwork. And here we have the Pabst family going out with some of their friends on Gustav Pabst's carriage that he had just taken delivery of in 1896, which was at a cost of $30,000, when average working class salary was about $500 a year. So somebody was saying to me, this is equivalent of a Ferrari 1890s style. The Pabsts were minimalists. That's always my stock joke when we enter the front hall. very typical of a home of the 1890s. Just very much every surface is covered. Every room on the first and second floors of the Pabst Mansion is given its own architectural identity. So we have German Renaissance in the front hall, French Rococo in Mrs. Pabst's parlor. Again, furniture and wall decorations to complement. The formal dining room was done the Louis XV style. As we saw earlier, Captain Pabst's study was done in a 17th century German Renaissance design using oak and walnut paneling. Again, this is all part of this kind of recreating this Germanic part of his past that he is also celebrating. While the Pabst Mansion was completed in 1892, the house wasn't completely finished until a few years later, and it had to wait for the last element to the house to arrive. That element was the Pabst Pavilion that was designed by Otto Strack, who was the eventual architect of the Pabst Theater. And in 1893, he designed this Baroque Beaux-Arts gem that was to display Pabst products during the World's Fair. And the entire structure is terracotta. The dome was all art glass, so it was a very beautiful structure. After the fair had closed, the brewing company had secured the Supreme Award for brewing internationally, and Captain Pabst had the entire structure dismantled, crated up, brought up to Milwaukee, and reassembled and attached to his mansion as a private conservatory, which is still there to this day. In the midst of all this, and it's so funny, when you really start putting all of these different projects together, it's just kind of remarkable that juggling all these different projects, that they all came to fruition, were by and large successful. But between 1891 and 1893, Captain Pabst had commissioned the Chicago architect Solon Spencer Beeman, who was the architect of Pullman, south of Chicago, that whole city. He came up to Milwaukee, designed Milwaukee's first skyscraper, which was essentially 16 stories tall. It housed many professional offices, including on the first floor the Wisconsin National Bank, of which Captain Pabst was president. And then he also had an office on the top floor that overlooked the city. North of Milwaukee, right around the time when Best became Pabst, they secured acreage north of the city in Whitefish Bay to create a pleasure ground. And so this was the entrance. This is that corner right on Lake Drive, right at Henry Clay, I'm assuming is at the foreground. And there were a few ways that you could get up to the Whitefish Bay resorts. Probably one of the most popular was to take one of these lake steamers from the Grand Avenue dock at Grand Avenue and the Milwaukee River, so right by the Riverside Theater. And this would take you down the Milwaukee River, and you would kind of turn to the port side or hang a left and go north up to Whitefish Bay. And this would run several times during the course of the day, or you could take a streetcar up there, or you could take a carriage. So it was very popular, and essentially it was a beer garden and a restaurant. There were plans to build a hotel as part of the complex, but that never came to fruition. But this was popular for almost a quarter century. It ran all the way through 1913 before it eventually closed and the property was subdivided. Captain Pabst got involved in the German dramatic arts in 1890. He had purchased the old Nunemacher Opera House, which had been built in 1871, and had it redecorated. His son-in-law, who had married his eldest daughter, Otto von Ernst, was put in charge of the decoration of the theater. He was part of the German panorama painter group, and so he was put in charge of this. And unfortunately, the theater only existed in this form for about another 4 years. In January of 1895, a bit of scenery caught on fire and gutted the Stadt Theater. This is a great photograph that was actually taken on the day of the fire, and you can see all the onlookers in the lower left-hand corner watching it be consumed. Now, what was interesting about this, Captain Pabst was on a year-long trip throughout the Mediterranean and Europe, kind of taking a year off, and his boys were left in charge of the brewing company, and they really didn't want to spoil his trip by telling him that the theater had burned down. And unfortunately, Captain Pabst picked up a newspaper in Wiesbaden, Germany, and that's how he read that his theater had burned down. So supposedly he dispatched a telegram to Milwaukee to his sons and said, "Rebuild at once." And even after all these years, I'm still amazed that they cleared the site off. They started laying the foundations of the new theater in April. Otto Strack, again, was the architect of the new theater. And so it starts in April, and they open November 9th, 1895. So that year, 7 months later, they open for their fall season. So I think when the world kind of starts up again, and the next time you end up in the Pabst Theater, just remember that that magnificent theater was built in 7 months, and just remarkable. The Pabst Theater has dodged a few bullets over the years. Incredibly, in the 1920s, when it was really struggling, there was talk of gutting the theater and turning it into a parking structure for cars. Then, of course, in the 1960s and 70s, it came very close to being torn down, especially after the Performing Arts Center had been opened in the late 1960s, and the Pabst Theater was seen as being redundant, but went through a major restoration in 1974, and then again in the mid-1990s. And so the Pabst Theater, I think, was very much with us for the long haul. Kitty corner from the theater, so right in kind of City Hall Square, Captain Pabst owned the St. Charles Hotel, and there was also behind it on Broadway Street was the Pabst Heat, Lights, and Power Company, which supplied heat, light, and power to the St. Charles Hotel, the Kirby House Hotel, the Pabst Building, the Pabst Theater, and several other Pabst properties on that side of the river. So he had his own power plant supplying energy for this. The St. Charles is eventually torn down in 1932, and Marshall and Ilsley build their tower there in 1968. And so the new BMO tower is just to the left of where this photograph was taken. Of course, tied houses were an important part of the distribution of Pabst and products. Both Pabst and Schlitz and Miller and Blatz owned tied houses. Pabst and Schlitz owned many, many, many tied houses in Milwaukee and Chicago. And Otto Strack had kind of set the aesthetic design for these tied houses with this Teutonic battlement style. And fortunately, this one has survived. Now is Ristorante Bartolotta in Wauwatosa. So this is still, you can still visit it. Likewise, you can still go to the Red Circle Inn in Neshota, which Captain Pabst purchased in 1889 and named it the Red Circle Inn. It was actually a coaching inn that went back to the 1840s, and now lays claim as being the oldest restaurant in the state of Wisconsin. In town was the Empire Cafe and Restaurant, and this was on the corner of Plankinton and Grand Avenue. So that is essentially, it's still called the Empire Building today, kind of an homage to the original Empire Building that we're looking at right here. But that's right where the Riverside Theater is today. And this was one of Captain Pabst's premier tied houses in Milwaukee. And this is a great close-up of the glass sign framed by a Cyril Kolnick wrought iron frame. Now, further afield, he had kind of audacious ideas in the late 1890s. And as I was mentioning about Western and Eastern shipping brewing companies, Western brewer really wasn't welcomed into the New York market for many reasons, because they didn't want your products available in those regions. But Captain Pabst forged ahead and created several kind of amazing venues. Pabst Harlem was located on 125th Street between 7th and 8th, and opened in September of 1899. Its claim to fame was that it could seat 1,400 people at one time and turn all those tables. And this stayed in business all the way through up to Prohibition. The building still exists. It doesn't look anything like this, but it's actually from the back alleyway that you can still see the red brick original building. So it still exists in one form or another. He went right to the heart of Manhattan, and he leased a portion of Longacre Square. And between 1899 and 1900, he had Otto Strack, who had now actually followed the brewing company to New York, and he stayed in New York for the rest of his career. And he designed the Pabst Hotel at Broadway and 42nd Street. And remarkably, this is not a construction photograph, but this is a deconstruction photograph, because the subway was being installed right underneath the Pabst Hotel in 1902. It was condemned and demolished, and had the historical footnote of being the first structural steel skyscraper to be demolished in Manhattan. So with the loss of that building, they went across town to Columbus Circle, at the Columbus Circle entrance to Central Park, and built a Pabst Grand Circle, again designed by Otto Strack, who got a lot of business from the Pabst Brewing Company. And this was a combined restaurant, hotel, and theater, which is no longer around, but did survive at least to Prohibition. And then finally, Pabst Coney Island Loop, which was a very smart place to put a saloon, where all the trolley cars that went out to Coney Island had to turn around in this barn-like enclosure, which, if it looks a little bit flammable, it was. And in 1908, it burned to the ground and was not rebuilt. By the 1890s, the Pabsts had become art collectors, and I just wanted to touch on a few of the works of art that they had purchased, some for their homes and some for their restaurants, which is really interesting. I always believe that they kind of ran out of room in the mansion, and then they started purchasing works of art for their different places. So one of the most iconic works of the period was that they had hired Albert Francis King, who was a very well-known still life artist in the 1890s, to do two paintings, this one and the next one that we'll be seeing, of Pabst beer with oysters on the half shell. And this was to roll out the new Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. So that beer had been their select brand, but in 1882, they came up with the idea of tying blue ribbons onto the beer bottles. And by 1898, it was so well associated with that particular beer that they changed the name to Pabst Blue Ribbon. And so there actually wasn't a Blue Ribbon one. That's always my little trivia game that I always throw out, that did Pabst actually win a Blue Ribbon or not. And this was the other painting. The other painting doesn't have the bottles uncorked. This one has one of them and the glass filled, and this was the one that was used in advertising essentially almost right up to the beginning of Prohibition in the late teens. Another work of art, which I've always been very interested in this particular painting and print. This was a premium that you would have sent to you after you had purchased a number of Pabst malt extract bottles. And the image is of this young girl trying to catch some birds that have landed on this bowl of milk and bread. And this print was very familiar to me through my entire life, beginning with my childhood. My grandmother had this print on her wall, and I've always remembered it. And I remember as a teenager reading in the small print that there's a Pabst Brewing Company copyright on it. And just to show you that she had this is my grandmother with my dad in the 1930s, and there is that print on the wall. And so eventually I started realizing that the painting had been in the mansion, or that Captain Pabst had owned the painting at some point, and then finally figuring out that it had been in the mansion. And I had always hoped that someday the painting would resurface. Through inventories, we were able to figure out that the original painting had gone to the Pabst Mill d'Armerie, and that it was probably sold in the 1950s when her husband had passed away, but it had never surfaced in any auction room. And then 5 years ago, on a Saturday morning, I received a text and my phone pinged, and an antique dealer friend of mine had texted me a photo of a painting, and he said, "Do you recognize this painting?" And remarkably, the painting had probably been sold at that auction in Fox Point in the 1950s, had been purchased by a Milwaukee family, and had ended up in a storage unit in Mequon. And you can imagine, all these years having seen it as a print, and to finally see the original work of art was amazing. And the Pabst Mansion was very fortunate to have two separate donors that came forward to purchase this painting for the mansion's permanent collection, which is on the grand staircase. So next time you're at the Pabst Mansion, you walk past this painting, you can think of that long history this particular work has had with the Pabst family. Now, a work of a completely different genre, but sensational, and about the size of a garage door, where the other one was the size of a very small work of art. This painting had a remarkable, or is having, I should say, a remarkable history. So it was painted by Konstantin Makovsky, who was one of the leading painters of Imperial Russia in 1889, and it won a gold medal in Paris that same year, and was purchased by Charles Schumann in New York City. He had a jewelry store, and he loved Konstantin Makovsky's works, and he had a number of them that he would display in his shop. And they're obviously such sensational paintings that people would throng into his shop, and he was actually charging admission just to kind of keep the numbers of people down in his shop. I should just mention the Judgment of Paris. So Paris is the gentleman with the apple, giving it to the fairest of the fair, who's Venus in the center of the composition. Minerva's on the right, and Juno is to the left. And so this work of art was in New York City in the 1890s. And Henry Reinhardt, who was a Milwaukee art dealer, was friends with not only Charles Schumann in New York, but also Frederick Pabst. And the art dealer, Reinhardt, would sometimes bring Schumann's paintings to Milwaukee for these summer exhibitions that took place at the Exposition Building. And in 1895, he wanted to bring this painting to Milwaukee. and it was deemed too strong for the Milwaukee market. And so it stayed in New York, but somehow Reinhardt convinced Schumann to sell the painting to Captain Pabst. And so Pabst bought it for like $20,000 in 1897 and put it in his Empire Cafe, which is where the Riverside Theater is today. So, and of course, you can imagine this was like sensational, and people want to go to the Empire Cafe to see this painting. So Prohibition rolls around in 1919. The painting is taken to the Milwaukee Athletic Club and is on display there for 64 years at the at the end of a long room at the athletic club. And everybody kind of forgets that this painting is there or that was important. And in the mid 1980s, the then owner of the Brewing Company recalled all of these paintings that were around the city and put them all in storage. And so in September of 2004, that's when I was invited to go to this warehouse to see these paintings. I had no idea that all these had stayed intact. And so I had the painting taken out into the alleyway, as you can see in this photograph, so I could photograph it in the light. The paintings were being prepared to go to Sotheby's in New York City to be sold. And so once this painting made it back to New York, the art market went absolutely berserk, because this had been a very well-known painting in the 19th century, had completely gone off the radar. Probably people thought it had been destroyed, but there it was. And it went up for sale in April of 2005. The auction price, including the hammer price and the fees, over $2 million was paid for this painting. And that the painting was cleaned and is now, if you want to see it, it is being exhibited. It has gone back to Russia. It's in the Fabergé Museum in St. Petersburg. And what a fascinating journey for this magnificent painting. So Captain Pabst, he really enjoyed having his portrait painted, his picture or his likeness photographed. He had sculptures done during his lifetime, and he really wanted Franz von Lembach, who was one of the top portrait painters in Germany in the 1890s, to paint his portrait. And there's a great Pabst family lore about this painting, and because it is such a severe likeness of Captain Pabst, that we know that Pabst was in Germany in 1895, and at the end of the summer of that year, he was going to meet with Lembach, and he really wanted Lembach to paint his portrait, but Lembach was ready to go on his vacation as well. And Captain Pabst apparently really gave him what for about giving his or having his portrait painted. And so Lembach was like, "Sure, I'll paint your portrait," and really captured the steely gaze of Captain Pabst in this, including the fact that Captain Pabst had pot-marked skin on his left cheek, which nobody knew about because it was always retouched in photographs. So you can imagine Captain Pabst uncrating this painting, which he'd really been looking forward to, and he had it installed in the parlor at the Pabst Mansion. But what was interesting, he actually had an artist here in Milwaukee touch up and overpaint his cheek. And so nobody knew about this until the branch of the family that had inherited the portrait sent it out for conservation in Boston in the early 1990s, so 100 years later. And the conservators said, "Well, there's overpainting. Do you want it taken off?" And they're like, "Sure." They had no idea. So now the Lembach portrait is seen the way Lembach wanted you to see Captain Pabst, but not necessarily the way he wanted you to see, which was actually more like the friendly photographs that much more relaxed of Captain Pabst done by Simon Stein here in Milwaukee, or even more relaxed, this portrait of Captain Pabst with his newspaper taken in the 1880s. So one of Captain Pabst's last heroic civic projects that he did was to help a project that had taken almost 35 years to complete. And right after the Civil War, there was a movement in Milwaukee to create a memorial or a recognition of the Civil War soldiers that had fought, and Wisconsin had several regiments that had distinguished themselves. And so Alexander Mitchell, Milwaukee's great railroad magnate of the 1860s and 70s, had offered early that he would sponsor it. And by 1885, he had committed himself to doing this project. And then he passes away in 1887. And so it was the project was inherited by his son, Congressman John Mitchell, who had pushed the project forward, had secured the sculptor John Severino Conway to design the statue and to begin working on it, and got underway. And then the financial panic of 1893 set everything back again. And so Lydia Ely, who was a Milwaukee artist herself, came up with the idea of gathering up a uniform selection of 2,283 autographs of the great and the good, representing politics, arts, literature, and famous personalities in America, and have them bound into a magnificent autograph album that would eventually be auctioned off to hopefully raise the $8,500 that they needed to finish the project. And the autograph album is like 2 feet by 2 feet by 10 inches thick. I mean, it's a huge, huge tome. And when the project was done, Captain Pabst stepped forward and he's like, I'll purchase the autograph album so we could finally get this project completed. And so he held on to the photograph album and was put into the vault at the Pabst Brewing Company. Eventually, it was donated in 1914 by Gustav Pabst to the Milwaukee Public Library. So next time you're at the library, you'll see it displayed in their rarities room. So it is there for all of us to enjoy. And here is the throng of people celebrating the dedication of the Victorious Charge in June of 1898. And we have the tower of the Wisconsin Club, or the Mitchell home, right in the background. So here we have Captain Pabst at his desk at the Brewing Company. By 1902, his health is failing him. He has emphysema and diabetes and pulmonary edema, and these were conditions that he was dealing with throughout the 1890s through doing all of these amazing projects that we've looked at tonight. But finally, his health was really declining. And in 1899, even foreshadowing this period of his life, he had placed a letter along with his last will and testament. I just wanted to read you a quick portion of it. I have the earnest and cherished desire that you will, after I am gone, strive to preserve harmony and goodwill and unselfish relations among yourselves. Try to keep the estate I leave you together as far as you can, and make it productive, if not only of increase and substance, but let it be a cause for mutual confidence and affection. Each of you should yield to the other more or less, if necessary, to preserve harmony and union. Sickness and misfortune, perhaps something worse, can come to some one of you. But my dear children, face it bravely and with hearts full of love for each other, and do just what you think I would have you do if I were present to advise and counsel you. Be generous and unselfish to each other, and in case of need, above all, be honest and noble in all your dealings, not only with each other, but with the world. I want you all to have a good name. It's better than riches, and your greatest happiness will come from your knowledge of doing right. So that was the letter that his children found with his final papers. He passed away on January 1st, 1904, just shy of his 68th birthday. which is pretty remarkable. Average life expectancy for a man at that time was just around 45, so that he lived with all those health conditions up to almost 68 is pretty remarkable. His death was felt keenly around the country. I mean, there are newspaper clippings actually from around the world noting his passing, and over 3,000 workers and mourners came through the Pabst Mansion to say their final goodbye before he was taken out to Forest Home Cemetery. Gustav Pabst, his eldest son, was given the presidency of the company the following week, and he would continue. He was always known as being much like Captain Pabst, and Gustav would continue in the same vein that his father had ran the company. And within a few years, he was already having to start dealing with the reality of the Prohibition movement that would eventually bring kind of the Pabst Brewing Company to a close through those years. And his brother, Fred Pabst Jr., who ran and operated Pabst Farms, would then take the presidency, see the brewing company through Prohibition to the point when they could reopen in 1933. But that's for another day. And so I will end it there, John.
Oh, wonderful! That was. It's always. I love hearing from you, John. It's just like.
Thank you. It's
the wealth of knowledge is just amazing. So I'm going to put up a thing here because I want people to ask questions, because now they have you. you're the captive audience.
I always think I'm putting everybody to sleep while I'm doing it.
Absolutely not. No, it's just so interesting. So I'll start with a few questions while we get some questions into the comments. But you mentioned, like, during the Grand Army of the Republic reunion that happened, that the brewery was given tours, and it was like a tourist attraction. Is that it? Because now, people come to Milwaukee and they'll go to the old Pabst Brewing Complex, or they'll go to places like Lakefront or Mobcraft or Sprecher or something. They'll go to places for beer tourism. Is that like kind of the beginning of that?
It was. Yeah. No, this was definitely part of it. He really felt that, people coming to the brewing company and seeing it, there was always the issue of purity in those days of the product. So that was part of the reason why, you'd be able to come through the brewing company and see, that was a very clean environment, a clean product. And there's some really great stories. I mean, I know I don't edit myself very well, but there's some great stories of Captain Pabst giving tours himself. And there's a really famous one. I think it was a congressman from Ohio that went through the brewing company, and they get to the end of the tour, and this congressman thought he was going to be a real wiseacre, and asked for a Schlitz at the end of the tour. And Captain Pabst looked over at the bartender. He said, "A Schlitz for the congressman." And of course, he had his competitors' beer available. So Captain Pabst had the last laugh on that one. So
that's pretty funny. It's interesting to think about, because you talk about how Pabst's death was mourned, and the legacy of that, and how the relationship to the other beer barons is so present in that too.
Yes.
So to kind of go back in part of your presentation, the Gambrinus window, the stained glass window, is that around still?
It is, and it's a great question. And I really didn't think it was going to survive, because
so intricate.
When Pabst closed in 1996, the window was essentially boarded up because people were afraid that was going to get smashed out. And then, of course, the brewhouse was sitting vacant for, what was it, the better part of 15 years. So there were so many times when that could have been stolen or destroyed, and it does survive. I really have to give kudos to the Brewhouse Inn and Suites. They've done such a magnificent job preserving the Brewhouse. So you're still getting that view of all those kettles. And of course, that takes up valuable real estate in a hotel situation, but they've done it beautifully. So the kettles are all there, and then the stained glass windows at just where it's always been since the 1890s at the western end of the brew house. So I always use the analogy that it really is like a cathedral, where you have this, this beautiful space, and then you have this huge, enormous stained glass window at the end. And of course, this was all to play towards the tourists that were
absolutely.
So this was,
I always forget, living here, that I can just walk into that place.
Right. Yeah.
It's like when people come and stay, it's like, oh, that's when I'll go in. But no, I can go in and admire that at any time, and I'm sure they're very, very happy to have me in there. So
yeah.
So you spoke a lot about at the beginning about the start of Captain Pabst's life, and he was an immigrant. Did any of his accomplishments and his fame go back to Germany?
It did, and that's a fantastic question, Carrie. That Nicholas Reutz was very proud of their native son, and they really wanted Captain Pabst to pay for a road that connected the neighboring village or something like that. So they were always trying to get Pabst to do philanthropic work in that small town, which he might have done some gifts, but nothing that's major. He did go back occasionally to his hometown, but I don't think he probably did quite as much as they were hoping for. So there's still some letters in the archives there that are copies of ones that were sent to the Pabst family here. And I think a lot of that came maybe after Captain Pabst died, and that they really wanted the memorial road.
That is like a dream trip of mine, just thinking about like trips to Europe, is to go to, so you go to Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, and Miller's hometown.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Wouldn't that'd be a ton of fun, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's, I've always wanted to do it. One of the volunteers at the Pabst Mansion actually did make the trek there. And of course, at the beginning of my life, that was East Germany. So, I mean, that was kind of a lot more difficult, than it is now to get to.
What, you must have been, 3 years old?
Yes, there you are.
Yeah. Okay, one last one, just because I like to talk about drinking things. Rachel asks, what else did Captain Pabst like to imbibe?
Rachel, perfect question. He was much more of a wine drinker than a beer drinker. So he liked sweet German wines, and the cellar, he had part interest in a German winery, and he would have barrels full of wine sent to the house and then be decanted into bottles there. And the inventory when he died was something like 3,300 bottles of wine in the cellar of the Pabst Mansion, So he clearly didn't get around to all of it, but he tended more to wine. And I actually found just recently a Time magazine article from the 1930s saying that Captain Pabst was much more of an Epicurean with his taste for sweet wine. So even Time magazine in the 1930s knew about this.
That's funny. Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that either. So, well, John, thank you so much for your knowledge tonight and this presentation.
This was a lot of fun.
Fabulous.
So I appreciate it. So,
thank you everybody for tuning in. So stay tuned to both the Pabst Mansion and the Milwaukee County Historical Society social media pages for upcoming events. As far as what's happening closer to now, I will say that the Pabst Mansion's reopening on Saturday, so you can finally get back in. So pabstmansion.com, you can get information on that. And the Milwaukee County Historical Society is open as well with our exhibit about the role that water played. That's going through the end of April, so make sure you take advantage of that. But John, thank you so much for everything.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Everybody stay safe. And hey, we're going to have one of these presentations in person soon. That sounds just crazy, but it's going to happen. So we'll hopefully see you all in person soon, and have a good one.